pandemics are never simply biomedical events. They're also social, political, economic and cultural events.
I even want my latex gloves sanitized, sanitized, sanitized. Yeah, I learned this one thing, the 20-second plan. Now my water's running, I gotta wash my hands.
As we have seen in the 4 months since this new respiratory illness was first reported to have emerged in the Wuhan region of China, alongside the spread of contagious disease, there's a concurrent spread of contagious ideas. The novel coronavirus has gone viral in more ways than one. Messaging about it has far outpaced infection rates, saturating both mainstream media and social media. A quick Google search of the term COVID-19 gives us a sense of just how rapidly the outbreak of communication has spread. The search gives 5,730,000,000 results globally as of May the 5th. Of these results, Google classifies about 2,910,000,000 as news stories. As decades of communication research on media effects have illustrated, news media contribute to the meanings that people produce and act upon, albeit sometimes in quite unpredictable ways. Concepts have been developed to understand the ways that news media frame new viral threats and shape responses to it. For example, there is agenda setting, the ability of news media to create awareness and focus attention on particular issues by selecting out stories for coverage, thereby elevating them in importance. Another concept is the availability heuristic. This describes a cognitive bias in which audiences rely on readily available examples in order to evaluate new information. The sheer amount of print column inch and news broadcast attention being focused on the coronavirus gave us the sense that it was important and required our attention, that it should be central to the agenda. However, media saturation also gives the impression that a disease is rampant, at least as rampant as the number of news articles suggests.
During these uncertain times.
In uncertain times.
Unprecedented times.
Home. That's the key.
Media saturation was a reality in North America long before the number of cases began to climb. It meant that people had been primed for the pandemic's seriousness and would be more inclined to accept the public health measures that were to follow, including the closing of schools and businesses, self-isolation, and restrictions on movement. It also produced disbelief, the idea that the pandemic was a fake, since the alarm generated in the media didn't seem to match up with experiences of people on the ground in the early stages of the pandemic. A great number of headlines and broadcast story titles and screen crawls early in the pandemic liberally used the word fear. Experts, fear. Passengers, fear. Politicians, fear. The WHO, fears. Students, fear. Nurses, fear. Public health officials, fear. And journalists, fear as well. Fear that we fear too much, and they fear the fear may have created a coronavirus panic.
The future is coming. Panic now.
Fear was apparently contagious and was everywhere.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
In his research on news media cycles and emerging infectious diseases, Sheldon Ungar discusses the ways that news media coverage of viral threats create what he calls hot crises. This is a term he borrows in part from the epidemiological idea of a hotspot, or an area of elevated disease burden or high transmission efficiency. He uses this term to describe acute episodes of collective fear. Ungar identified two interpretive packages in news reporting on the 1995 Ebola Zaire outbreak that holds relevance for reporting on emerging infectious diseases today. He calls the first package the mutation contagion package, a package in which the microbial threat is amplified by means of pre-mediated ideas about emerging infectious diseases that are then projected onto new disease events. The mutation contagion package includes the idea of microbes on a rampage. It contains the idea that microbes are clever and, importantly, cleverer than those who would attempt to contain them. It points to the ways that human activity engineers conditions in which microbes can emerge from previously untouched environments and learn to jump species. It projects the idea that microbes know no boundaries and are but a short plane ride away in our increasingly interconnected world. It warns us that we are long overdue for the next big one. A pandemic the likes of which we have not seen since the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 19, that killed more people than died in battle during World War I. Some estimates suggest upwards of 33 million people died of this flu globally. The backdrop provided by the discourse on emerging infectious diseases has worked to pre-mediate infectious disease events like SARS and MERS, H1N1 2009, Zika and Ebola in such a way as to create an anticipatory anxiety, an expectation that the worst-case scenario is the only case scenario. This was the backdrop against which the COVID-19 pandemic appeared. Language that started to be used early in the outbreak included the use of constructions such as killer virus and public enemy number one, while subsequently attributes such as learning, hiding and lurking have been ascribed to the virus.
Is an Ebola-type virus lurking around in the state of Nagaland?
Contributing to tropes of microbial agency and human passivity. Language like this serves to frame understandings of the virus and the disease it causes. Metaphors of war, alien invasion, and natural disasters shape the meanings the virus takes on and can support or undermine public health efforts. One of Canada's few full-time health journalists, André Picard of the Globe and Mail, writes in his meta-analysis of media responses to the novel coronavirus. When you constantly update the number of cases and deaths, you wildly amplify incremental change. Of course people will be scared. Imagine if we sent out push alerts for every tuberculosis death, 1.5 million a year, and every measles death, 140,000 annually. Finding the balance between providing up-to-date information on a new threat and putting that threat into context is not easy.
We're all going to die, and there will be no one left to remember our story.
Placing COVID-19 in relational context, as Picard does, can work to assuage concerns about its scope and scale. Knowing, for example, that seasonal flu infects 9 to 45 million Americans annually and kills between 12 and 61,000 each year, can help to place COVID-19 in context. However, as we have seen, these comparisons can also be misleading, causing some to take the threat of infection less seriously than the public health emergency warrants. COVID-19 differs from seasonal flu in a number of ways. Not least because the novel coronavirus is new and its mechanisms, symptomatology and treatment are as yet unknown.
But with this particular coronavirus, we don't know. The science is just not there because it's new to humans, and we have no what's called herd immunity to this, because we're exposed to coronaviruses every year, cause of the common cold, or primarily the cause of the common cold. This one was a new one to humans, so we had no pre-existing immunity to it.
COVID-19 is distinctly not the flu. Some may take for granted that their age and a healthy immune system will protect them from this new disease, but this is not necessarily the case. Alongside the elderly and those with pre-existing medical conditions, young, previously healthy people are also getting sick and dying. And while the flu disproportionately affects disadvantaged populations, COVID-19 magnifies this many times over. Understanding rates of infection or calculating death rates per 100,000 people abstracts the costs of the pandemic, ignoring the very real stakes of this pandemic for the actual lives of people. On the other end of the continuum, comparisons like these can generate anxiety in reflection on how seasonal flu circulates, or on the challenges of inspiring flu vaccination. If it is difficult to encourage uptake of vaccination for seasonal flu, when we know how many people get seriously ill and die every year, how will we fare in the event both the flu and COVID-19 are circulating at the same time? Comparisons can both minimise the threat and amplify it.
We're all gonna die!
Compounding anxiety about the arrival of a pandemic is the Hollywood factor. The ways that epidemics and pandemics have been represented in popular culture, most notably in Hollywood films, but also in made-for-TV streaming programming. Interestingly, along with references to other infectious diseases that have been the subjects of real or anticipated pandemic moments, these popular cultural representations have also been the subject of significant discussion in news media. The discussions suggest that there are parallels to be drawn from, say, movies like Outbreak, Peter Wolfgang's 1995 film based on Richard Preston's popular book, The Hot Zone, or popular television programmes like The Walking Dead, and the recent docu-series Pandemic, or even older made-for-TV movies like Fatal Contact, Bird Flu in America. Netflix and other streaming sites reported a spike in streaming of pandemic and outbreak movies, such as Outbreak and Steven Soderbergh's 2011 film Contagion, when COVID-19 was still only a public health emergency of international interest, according to the World Health Organization. Popular culture is often a resource for making sense of the unprecedented, unexpected, or uncertain. It is also a site, problematic though it may be, of learning about health and health-related topics. The CDC knows this very well, as is evidenced by its work on what is called entertainment education, an initiative aimed at providing expert consultation and script suggestions and advice for the film and television industry. While realism and scientific accuracy may be the aim of initiatives such as this, the science often does not make for gripping drama. Soderbergh's Contagion drew on two primary consultants, infectious disease journalist and author of the New York Times bestseller The Coming Plague, Laurie Garrett, and technical advisor Dr. Ian Lipkin, a professor of epidemiology and director of the Center of Infection and Immunity at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. Lipkin's work on contagion is notable for a number of reasons.
I would just like to say on this show tonight that this has become very personal for me too, because I have COVID as of yesterday, and it is miserable.
I heard you cough. I didn't want to be a hypochondriac and say I hope you don't have it, but you do.
It can hit me. It can hit anybody. That's the message I want to convey.
He based the virus protagonist for the film on the Nipah virus because he wanted it to be something more interesting cinematically than an agent that causes only respiratory distress. It also aligns with Soderbergh's own claims about the film. At the back of our minds, we thought this movie could do for elevator buttons what Jaws did for the beach. This disaster film, in which over 26 million die, social organisation collapses, food becomes scarce, and fear dominates, made nearly 200 million at the box office and is currently ranked in the top 10 movie rentals on iTunes and number 14 on its list of most popular films. Like news reporting, films that play on fears of the worst-case scenario as the only case scenario mark the viral threat as imminent, uncontrollable, a force against which we will always be woefully unprepared. These films tell us that the big one is coming, that it is not a matter of if, but when. One concern that may be raised about the Hollywood factor is that it sets up unrealistic representations of what a pandemic will look like. In setting up the worst-case scenario as the obvious narrative trajectory for pandemics, it premeditates our expectations for the unfolding of actual pandemics. When the pandemic doesn't match our Hollywood imaginings of it, this can lead to the belief that the threat is not as serious as people have been told, and can lead to the erosion of trust in public health. On the other hand, these representations can lead to panic, including panic buying of toilet paper and hand sanitizer, or as we will see, the scapegoating of particular groups of people, which is the focus of the second media package Ungar writes about. The containment package works by attempting to erect secure conceptual barriers around the disease by means of metaphors of otherness. Simply put, it ascribes the identity of a disease to an other. In many ways of repeating one of the most troubling outcomes of the SARS outbreak in Toronto, these constructions have worked by way of identifying COVID-19 with people of Chinese descent. In the earliest stages, the disease was referred to as Chinese mystery pneumonia, Wuhan virus, Wuhan flu, Kung Fu flu, and Wuhan seafood market pneumonia virus, all names that problematically tied the disease to a race, to a location, or to cultural practices. As we have seen, these names are not simply descriptors of the origin of novel coronavirus, as some would argue. Rather, they become sites for the condensation of ideas and an economy of blame that has real, material consequences for actual people in the forms of violence, stigmatization, and scapegoating. Efforts have been made to dispel the idea that diseases belong to particular sorts of people. Disease naming now works to try to keep diseases conceptually distinct from the people they may affect. This was not the case with, say, the early naming of AIDS as gay-related immune deficiency, a construction that led to the stigmatization of gay men and misconceptions about heterosexual risk. COVID-19 simply names coronavirus disease and the year of its emergence. But its name was coined distinctly too late to discourage the problematic association of the disease with particular people and geographic spaces. This continues to have consequences and has contributed to an anti-Asian racism. Early on in the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that alongside this outbreak, there was a concurrent outbreak of racism, xenophobia, and stigmatization.
One of them shouted, "You ching-chong mother. You better cover your mouths before you kill all of us."
This not only affected the lived experiences of people problematically assumed to be the face of the disease. The stigmatization, as we saw with SARS in Toronto, has very real social and economic consequences. But it also stymies public health initiatives aimed at containing and managing a pandemic. An early opinion poll of 1,513 people, published on February 4th, 2020, suggested a majority of Canadians were not fearful of novel coronavirus. But there was a distinctly troubling outcome that this poll also highlighted. Assume you're on a bus and there's an empty seat beside you, the question reads. If a person of apparent Chinese origin, but no apparent symptoms of a cold, came and took that seat, would you move somewhere else to deliberately avoid being around that person because of what you have heard about the coronavirus? These are the results. Already, anti-Asian sentiments were taking hold. André Picard wrote in 2010, H1N1 was the first pandemic of the internet age. The first pandemic with a 24-hour news cycle. The first pandemic with its own chat groups and listservs. The first pandemic where we could trace the spread of the virus around the globe in real time. The first pandemic influenza virus, whose genome we could decode in the blink of an eye. COVID-19 was the second. Social media have created significant new obstacles for risk, health, and science communication.
Is this a fever? Is this just allergies? Caught in a lockdown, no escape from the family. Don't touch your eyes, just hand sanitize quickly. I'm just a poor boy, no job security, because of easy spread, even though I wash my hands laying low. I look out the window, the cup doesn't look flatter to me,
There has always been misinformation and disinformation circulating about infectious diseases. For example, there was the idea that the Spanish flu was sparked in an act of germ warfare by the Germans during World War I, or that AIDS was the result of a polio vaccination campaign gone awry. But never have they had a communication tool too that could spread the information so far, so quickly. While researchers have attempted to understand the mechanisms by which social media have contributed to, for example, the growth of the anti-vaccination movement and vaccine hesitancy, much is still not known about how it works or what material consequences it will have on global, national or local public health efforts, pandemic preparedness, and individual responses to the information of a disease threat. Tracking these effects is challenging. The scope of this work is vast and time-consuming, and responses to social media messaging are uncertain. The terrain of spreadable viral media is, like that of emerging infectious diseases, rapidly changing. It moves and mutates. There have been efforts such as Twitter's to direct user attention to information provided by the Public Health Agency of Canada or the Centres for Disease Control, or the World Health Organization's page Myth-Busting, False Notions about COVID-19. Such can go some way toward disrupting false, misleading or malicious content, but as we have seen with the unfolding of this pandemic, they do not stop them, nor do they stop the real-world effects the ideas they propagate may have. For example, the conspiracy theories tying COVID-19 to the rollout of the 5G network have led to arson attacks on cell towers. Germ panics, as we are seeing, have high stakes for the populations they target.
It came from China, homie. Everything comes from China.
And also for compliance with recommended public health interventions and protocols. They help to produce meanings that circulate, mediate, and pre-mediate experiences of the pandemic event. In the words of social and medical historian Nancy Tomes, the making of a germ panic has never been a wholly conscious or orderly process. The meanings that scientists, journalists, filmmakers and advertising agents attach to the menacing microbe vary enormously, and once they advance a particular interpretation of a germ, they immediately lose control of it. The meanings that COVID-19 takes on in different contexts is a result of the different ways it has been mediated public health officials, news media, Hollywood, and the new spaces of social media. These representations are not neutral. All have consequences for what it means to live in the time of COVID-19. They influence fundamental ideas about who is at risk and who is not, about vulnerability and invulnerability. They authorise germ panics, economies of fear and blame. These are the viral ideas of our pandemic moment.
Panic now.
Stay away from me. Baby, keep your distance, please. Stay away from me. Words of love in times like these. I'm gonna be with you 24 hours a day. A lot of people couldn't stand that, but you can. You be with me 24 hours a day. What